story of Exodus, the story of God's deliverance of the Israelite people from the oppressive hand of the Egyptians. We have followed Moses from birth to his call by God to lead his people into freedom, listening carefully as God led him to challenge the power of Pharaoh with the power of his God, the living God. We listened as God attempted to persuade Pharaoh with all manners of afflictions, with plagues and famine and disease and death, until finally they released the slaves and let them go. Last week, we celebrated as the Israelites put their trust in God and set out into the parted waters of the Red Sea, making it safely across, ahead of the Egyptian army's foiled last-minute capture. Their victory is celebrated with dance and song, for from the other side of the Red Sea, their freedom now seems secure, and God's promise apparently almost in hand. Today, the Israelites are waking up to the reality of that God-given freedom. And quite frankly, I think it must have surprised them that they were hungry. Because as their new life together begins to take shape, they also discover that it is hard to live together in freedom. Looking back, they begin to realize that life as a slave had certain advantages. For at least the Egyptians invested in feeding their otherwise free labor. Today they are hungry and tired, and not only are they wondering how they will eat, they are also considering, believe it or not, turning back. But God continues to listen to the cries of his hungry people, and he sends food enough for everyone daily as their needs arise. The story itself is a beautiful metaphor for the faithfulness of God, and how God's faithfulness towards his people leads to trust and faith and ultimately a way forward. But it also hints at what kind of new community God is forming out of the chaos in the wilderness. And at the very least, it seems to be a community based on the radical notion that everyone has the same basic needs, the same vulnerabilities, and when God's will and God's law is followed, everyone has enough, at least for today. That in itself is a very hopeful notion. But no one, apparently, can get rich on manna from heaven. And though no one can get rich, still everyone has enough. But is that the kind of community God is trying to form us into? It's a challenging ideal for us in our culture, but one I think that most of us can buy into, at least in principle. None of us wants anyone to go hungry, that's for sure. Every one of us is committed to the idea that we preserve the dignity of every human being, and we do that in the larger community with things like universal health care, unemployment insurance, government-subsidized daycare, and all sorts of other initiatives that ensure that as much as possible, everyone has a fair shot at a reasonable life, a decent job, and opportunities to contribute to the larger whole. But let's face it, none of us are necessarily opposed to people working longer hours or taking more difficult and challenging work and having a salary that actually reflects that. In fact, every one of us has grown up in a culture that reinforces such an idea for as long as any of us can remember. If you study harder and you get higher marks on the test, higher marks mean more opportunities. Take an extra shift at a part-time job, and you'd better get paid more than your co-worker who actually refused. Finish your schooling, get a better paying job. That's all fair, isn't it? And that's what makes today's gospel passage surprisingly difficult to swallow. The sun rises, and workers set out to earn a daily wage. daily bread. And they deserve it, don't they? They got there early. They worked all day. Yet even as they have already been working for several hours, other workers apparently show up. Eager to work maybe, but when the sun sets and the wages are given out, surely their pay will be slightly less, won't it? After all, they probably slept in. But no, as it turns out, not only do they get the same daily wages as the first to begin, but so do even later workers, and even the ones who only got there an hour or so towards the end. Now that's not fair. No one would think that's fair, would they? But think again. As Matthew puts it, the kingdom of heaven is like that. The kingdom of heaven is like that? I hope not. I mean, if the kingdom of heaven is like that, wouldn't everyone sleep in? Wouldn't everyone want to have a late breakfast and then a second breakfast? I mean, wait until the last minute to go into the marketplace and put in a couple of hours of hasty work and expect to earn a living wage? Maybe, maybe not. But it makes me wonder that if the kingdom of heaven is really like that, then what sort of community is this kingdom? Well, first of all, you have to say that it's not necessarily what we expect, that's for sure. And it seems to be a new kind of order. And as much as it seems to be based on equality, it is also based an awful lot on grace. There's a kindness, apparently, in God's generosity. Yes, the unemployed are treated with a surprising generosity, but there's more to it than that. The last are first to be paid, the first are last. It's apparently God who makes the rules, who hires the workers, who gives as he sees fit. So whether you are an early riser and a capable worker, or chronically unemployed, God's economy may not be what you think. It might even break against your treasured assumptions. And as I think about it this morning, the fact that the kingdom of heaven may not always be what we imagine, that it may surprise us or even make us cross, is perhaps just about the most important observation we make today. It makes me wonder sometimes if the best clue that God is at work bringing about change is the resistance we sense in being led in that direction. Sometimes it's hard to follow God into the promised land. It's not always what we think. So when the Israelites grumbled and God answered with just enough food for today and then just enough for tomorrow, it seems to me to be important that Aaron there purposefully turned the Israelites' vision away from the nostalgia of the abundance in Egypt towards the unknown, towards the wilderness, where they saw the glory of God appearing in the cloud. It may be apparently hard to see where you're going in the wilderness, but together, like the Israelites, maybe we can learn to trust that God is at work, bringing us to surprising places. When was the last time that you were surprised by where God was leading you? We talked about that in the preaching group that met to discuss the readings for this sermon. We talked about the surprising energy and effort that went into raising funds for our new organ, which we will celebrate with a concert in a couple of weeks. We wondered how some of that energy might now be channeled into something new. How do you look towards the cloud that leads to God's glory from a small but faithful community in Montreal? And somehow we began to talk about the controversial fact that Canada still mines and sells asbestos to certain developing countries, despite the fact that in Canada we have decided that asbestos is unsafe for any use by anyone, anywhere. But there's nothing we can do about that, is there? In fact, we spend a great deal of energy currently in Canada, and energy and resources to actually remove that asbestos from our buildings, public or private. Isn't that what we're supposed to be doing? Ultimately, the powers that be seem willing to look the other way as the trade occurs. it's started, it's challenging to have it stop. Jobs are at stake. What is legal in one country is illegal in another. And though it is not difficult to understand why it's wrong to sell something that you know is hazardous, it's difficult to clearly see what it is that a few ordinary, simple people like us can do about it. And yet, doing nothing is also a political choice. Is it one that we can afford to take, or is it one that we are willing to take? I wonder. And about that choice, I have this gospel message to offer you this morning. In God's kingdom, every person, whether they live in Egypt or Israel, Canada or India, can expect nothing less than their basic needs to be met. And those basic needs include a safe environment in which to live and work and study. And just as in the wilderness with the Israelites, in God's kingdom, everyone has the same needs and the same vulnerabilities. In God's kingdom, the ones who are most able, the ones from whom are often the ones from whom the most is expected. For just because you begin to earn your daily bread when others are left behind in the marketplace, it doesn't mean that you're entitled to more wealth, or to better health. And finally, our God is a faithful God, and He will surprise you with the places He will lead you. But His surprising nature is tempered also by His faithfulness, and He will continue to be faithful even when we are led through what may seem to be a cloud. For God has only one dream for His kingdom, and that dream is that there will be enough for all in a kingdom that favors mercy and kindness and a table where each of us receives our daily bread.